Hi, my name is Sarah Tofik. This is Art 503, Foundations of Art Education, and today I will be talking about the life and philosophy of Charles Gaitskell. So Charles Gaitskell lived a simple early life in the fine country of Warwickshire. When he was a young man, he was exposed to hunting through his father's passion for hunting and was opposed to it. Gaitskell had considered himself a pacifist, which is someone who considers war and violence unacceptable. Gaitskell had to travel toward Vancouver in order to escape the post-war of Britain in 1979 with his family. His life was consumed with conversations about war, and he'd had an intricate relationship with his father because of it. His father was consistently fighting in the war and aiding in relief to Belgium. Although Gaitskell lived among war, he lived a quiet life with his mother and grandmother. When he was a young man, he'd become a soloist for the choir with his church at St. Paul. When his father had returned from the war, business had brought his family to Thetis Island, where young Gaitskell found it difficult to make friends. He'd found himself burying himself among paintings. His father owned many yachts as well, and he would often ride in yachts during the summer while winters were spent in Victoria. His winters were also spent in the University of Vancouver later in his upbringing. Due to his love for painting, in which his family had seen in him, Gaitskell's father had proposed that he'd become a designer. He attended university in the States as his father thought that it would be best for him. He attended the Otis Institute in Los Angeles. Due to his rugby background in college, Gaitskell was able to do some back-breaking work for himself as his father was struggling with his financial crisis in the 1920s during Pearl Harbor and the negative outcomes of World War II. He'd worked as a harvester and laborer and a resawer, which were all difficult manual work positions. It was through his perception and understanding of the teaching program within the Victoria Teachers College that Gaitskell had started to learn the art of teaching. There was very little in terms of art education that was supplied for students to learn within the teachers' school in which he attended, which baffled Gaitskell into taking action to make the arts more visible within education. Through this, he'd started to build theater sets for the model school and passed the first-class British Columbia teacher's certification and became education certified. Gaitskell's first position was in the Peace River country of British Columbia, where he'd made $850 a year. He taught 22 young students within the low temperatures of the Peace River County. He worked in extremely miserable circumstances in the dead of winter, while it was still extremely dark and cold. He still managed a way to view these circumstances in an artistic way as seen in his writings. Gaitskell would spend many of his weekends working in manual labor while working with students during the weekdays. After some time as an educator in Peace River County, the chairman of the Dawson Creek School Board offered Gaitskell a position as principal of a combined elementary and high school in the town right over. Through this experience, he'd learned many ways of teaching. He'd taken on the responsibility that many educators didn't want. He'd also been one of the first educators to open a junior high school with British Columbia. Within the Peace River educational system, Gaitskell had created programs for instruction for students and teachers to help them understand the arts in new and exciting ways, since there was very little to no programs within the subject of arts in the North. Gaitskell had created his thesis through the Arts Initiative, he created and titled it An Experiment in the Art Instruction in the Peace River Educational System. He was extremely encouraging to the students that had created art in the program, and he wanted to consistently display them around town. Gaitskell began his journey in writing for publication while he'd been involved in becoming an art educator. He produced many works while re-entering university. He had even decided to take a full year off education in order to go back and study. He'd received a BA in French and English in the University of British Columbia and wrote his thesis on the significance of art education within schools. Shortly after achieving his BA in British Columbia, Gaitskell had received a position in Powell River, where he'd taught art and French while supervising 4 other local schools in the area to see their thriving art department. He was later presented a position teaching art to teachers due to his criticism of the art education program within British Columbia. Here are just a couple of the books that Gaitskell had created. We will talk about this further in later slides. While coming up with a proper analysis on how the educational system was flawed within art education classrooms in Ontario, Gaitskell and his team created illustrated books and art books for education classrooms that he'd received a profit off of. Shortly after Gaitskell's books were published, film production started on programs that specifically benefited art education. They were a financial success through sales in America. The best thing to have come out of these films were the distribution of knowledge regarding art education. Once there had been news of the creator behind these educational films, Gaitskell was asked to speak across Canada and the United States. Later in his career, after writing textbooks regarding art education, he was asked to speak for UNESCO in France and England. During his time in England, Gaitskell and several national representatives formed the International Society of Education through Art, otherwise known as INSEE, as well as a report entitled The Visual Arts in General Education. After attending a NAEA seminar in New York, Gaitskell had returned to Canada to discuss establishing their own National Society for Education through Art. They had established the Canadian Education Association. They had become one of Canada's first art societies. They had received a tremendous amount of help from the city of Quebec for the Canadian Society of Education through Art, which Gaitskell had been elected to be president for. They had created various types of official documents such as a constitution and a newsletter to help make the organization more official. They even developed a statement of policy in which they had set up a scholarship for students in art education through college. The CSEA was one of the most successful societies to make an impact on art education today. It had also established an assembly in which they had invited members of art communities throughout the entire world. The assembly was a success. The NCA administration created a large sum of money through the assembly. Due to the results of CSEA, the Ontario Ministry of Education decided to promote Gaitskell to Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum, which he'd received an award for outstanding contribution to education. After contemplating retirement, Gaitskell returned and decided to be a consultant for the Visual Arts Department for Catholic Metropolitan Separate School Board of the Toronto area. Through this experience, He developed and published smaller books, one of them entitled Art Education, A Catholic Dimension. This was a theoretical guideline for this school. In Powell River, Gaitskell encountered his most productive years of writing, drawing, painting, and studying. He'd created 6 plays for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and he had created incentives for the British Columbia Educational Department in Victoria, criticizing their lack of attention to art within the school system. It was through his paintings of the British Columbia landscape that were presented in the Vancouver Art Gallery where he really saw himself as an art educator. Initially during Gaitskell's time at the University of Toronto, where he'd attended to receive his doctorate, he'd been having trouble finding a topic for his thesis. While writing his survey of art education in Ontario, he'd examined that the program had a lack of artistic freedom within the classroom that did not allow students to grow in the arts. He'd also critiqued that the art educators did not have an improved understanding of education through art and what art can be for students. Gaitskell gave himself 5 years to change the art education program as art director. He wanted to change the rigid mentality of color exercise and copy work to expression-filled and natural art education. The first proposition that was held was the orchestration of summer courses for educators by artists across the world. Luckily, Gaitskell made many friends in his travels and had convinced many of them to stay and enjoy Ontario. The summer art course for instructors had become so extensive, ranging from 2,000 enrollments to 200 staff members, educating and discussing how art should be taught to students. The course became so extensive that it started to receive publicity. There were several educational influences on Gaitskell's career. The Dean of Education at the University of British Columbia had recommended Gaitskell to the University of Toronto for his doctorate program. He'd been accepted through the proposal of the Dean of Education primarily. Within the office of the Chief Director of Education for the province of Ontario, Gaitskell was introduced to Dr. John Althos. They worked closely together for around 20 years. He'd assigned Gaitskell a survey for the province they were in on art education in Ontario based on his writing thesis for the MA work. Gaitskell was inspired by his leadership and teaching style, referring to it as direct, impartial, learned, and severe yet kind. Another key educator and artist that had played a role in Gaitskell's model of teaching was Kichi Mori, who had translated parts of Gaitskell's published work in Japanese to have translate art education theories to the other side of the world. Individuals that played significant roles in art, such as Ken Wienerbringer of the School Arts magazine in Buffalo, New York, and Victor DiMacchio, chairman of the art education for the Museum of Modern Art, gave Gaitskell many opportunities to explore the world of art and to publish art of his own. During his time in England with UNESCO, he'd met several individuals who'd later asked to teach his summer course in Canada. Gaitskell also praised an educator by the name of Sir Herbert Reed for his humility and his lack of interest in power or publicity. He had labeled Sir Reed as a philosophical genius and a hero as well as a saint. Dr. Plenderleith, the Director of Education for the Peace River Education System, was very excited and eager to understand more about the experiments that Gaitskell was working on for his thesis to create a better learning experience for students in the Peace River program. Charles and Margaret Gaitskell also published many of their writings together, including Art Education During Adolescence, Art Education in Kindergarten, as well as Children and Their Art Methods for the Elementary School. Charles Gaitskell had also written his thesis and titled it An Experiment in Art Instruction in the Peace River Educational Area, in which he analyzed how art education impacted students within his early career as an art educator. In this section within this paper, we will also analyze his writings to better understand him and his educational philosophy. In his thesis, he begins the conversation by stating that Herbert Spencer placed art in a category in which art was least prioritized. However, many progressive programs consider art to be a priority within school activities as it connects students to different art forms. Further, art education becomes a beneficial commentary on social background and history. Gaitskell speaks on his experience in elementary schools teaching art and his encounters with art assignments rather than expressionistic paintings and drawings where students can express themselves emotionally and freely. To him, these types of instances were much more substantial and effective than overdone art assignments. Within his thesis, Gaitskell goes over some significant aspects of what has impacted specifically the art education programs within Peace River in the mid-1930s, including the history of the ways they teach their programs. He'd examined that within the Peace River area, that there was a lack of art educators to begin with because there was a lack of priority to the programs. He had set up an experiment for a new art program within the Peace River area. They had theorized that the understanding and skill of the instructors can improve as well as the program can be adjusted to the needs of the students for social and expressional artistic value. There were several recommendations that were made through the experiment. There needs to be an encouragement of instructors in order to move forward with continued effort for student encouragement. A supervisor of the program needs to be appointed in order to encourage and support instructors with the art programs. The curriculum of the program needed to be included more student involvement and efforts as well. The students need to be invested in the art, and the needs of the students need to be met through these programs. General preparation for instructors need to be appointed also, and these instructors need to have certain beliefs set in place for them to be educators and for them to continue to teach. In his book, Art Education During Adolescence, Gaitskell deals with how each age group should be treated and handled specifically in accordance with art education and art programs. He makes sure to allow the reader to understand that every formula for excellence in an art education classroom or curriculum is conditional and based on several different situations that the instructor must examine. There is not a viable answer to what a good art education program consists of. However, to a certain degree, students want to learn about what they are seeing and exploring in the world around them. It is important to keep that in consideration. Gaitskell's Children and Their Art Methods for the Elementary School explains how art exploration is significant to elementary school students by revealing a philosophy that makes sense as well as the classroom experience that he'd received over the years of being an art educator. In every one of Gaitskell's books, he is advising educators to be present themselves professionally in the context of training themselves to become effective art educators. He also makes sure to assess the needs for an art education program to be excellent under every circumstance. The final book examination was Art Education in Kindergarten, which takes a 2-year examination of kindergarten classes and around 9,000 kindergarten students to better assist both educators and parents to allow their children and/or students to express themselves through art. In this book, Gaitskell examines the importance of art in small children and how it affects motor skills and cognitive abilities through developmental stages of their growth. He also examines how kindergarten students express themselves through means of painting and drawing, which helps them connect with themselves and children around them. Gaitskell also makes it clear that the students' social interaction, differing backgrounds, home backgrounds, and school experiences all take precedent in this experiment. The most appreciated quality of each study was the examination of students' and teachers' work to assist the study. It gives young children a voice and expression among their adult world. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.